when we live inside a pattern, we don't know that we're living inside a pattern, which is why it's hard for people to type themselves. We just think that's reality, right? And we don't, it's like the Johari box. There's what we don't know that we don't know. And I didn't know how desperately disconnected I was. See, that's the difference. It was like I didn't feel as a child I was missing out on anything. I thought I was fine. I thought watching the ants was more interesting.
Welcome to another episode of What It's Like to Be You. I am Josh Levine, your host, and I am very honored and excited to present my guest today, Russ Hudson. Russ is a legend in the Enneagram world. He's been teaching for over 30 years. He's the co-founder of the Enneagram Institute and the founding director and former vice president of the International Enneagram Association. And he and his longtime former collaborator, Don Riso, wrote a number of Enneagram books, including what is considered to be a modern classic of the Enneagram, The Wisdom of the Enneagram, which is also the very first book on the Enneagram that I ever read, and it kind of had a huge impact on me. It changed my life. Russ has also spoken on national television, on a number of TV shows, including Good Morning America and CBS Morning Show as an expert in personality types. And he's also a very popular speaker around the world at retreats and conferences like the Esalen Institute, the Wisdom 2.0 Conference, and the Science and Non-Duality Conference. Russ is a social sexual type 5, and it's pretty hard to state in words how big of an impact Russ has had on the Enneagram world. His teachings are everywhere, and so many people have been influenced by him, and so many of the current teachers in the world on the Enneagram were trained by some of his materials. And also, I want to say that just his transmission when he speaks is so clear. It's one of the clearest that I've ever heard. And on a personal note, there's this incredible program that he did with Richard Rohr called the Enneagram and Grace, where he and Richard Rohr kind of trade talking about the Enneagram types. And I've listened to it like 10 times, and it's just beautiful and very clear. I think Russ is one of the purest transmitters of the depths of the Enneagram and its usefulness for conscious transformation and personal growth that I've ever heard. And I'm very honored to interview him about his personal life. He tends to speak a lot about other people and the Enneagram in general and the origins and history of the Enneagram and all that kind of stuff. He doesn't get a lot of opportunities to just speak about himself and his own journey. So I took this opportunity to ask him a lot of questions about that and to reveal his own inner world as a type 5 and what the Enneagram has done for him in his personal journey of transformation and growth. So without further ado, I am thrilled to introduce my guest today, a teacher to me and so many others, Russ Hudson.
You know, one of the things that's funny about interviewing you in this format is that you are obviously a renowned teacher of the Enneagram and you talk about the Enneagram a lot, but I'm wondering how often you have an opportunity to talk about yourself and your own journey with the Enneagram and kind of like discovering that you were a 5 and then understanding your life in retrospect through the frame of the Enneagram. Mm-hmm. And so I think what I'd like to do is start with a pretty open-ended question of, can you talk about just your personal Enneagram journey? How did you discover that you were a 5? What did it make sense of in your life? And then we'll pull some themes out from that and go from there.
Okay, sure. Well, I think to answer that question, I have to take into account that I kind of backed into the Enneagram typology.
Okay.
I'm not yet unlike most people, I was doing the fourth ways teachings first. I was in the Gurdjieff work, was working with the core lineage of the Gurdjieff work, and we didn't talk about Enneagram types. There were not Enneagram types in that framework. But we did have teachings about what's called chief feature. And I had heard various rumors. I read that first article about Ichazo's work that was in a book called Transpersonal Psychologies, which I acquired in the 1980s. And it was interesting, but it didn't grab me exactly. I was sort of curious that people were using the Enneagram in a very different way than how I had learned it. But then it was Don Riso's first book, Personality Types, that I went through and read, and I thought, wow, this is really something. This actually would be very useful to anybody doing inner work. And like a lot of people, when when I first read his book and was thinking about it, I thought it was a 4. And, a lot of people, partly I joke about that because, a lot of times when people are seeking out a self-help book, they're not usually in the best part of their life. You don't get a self-help book because you just won the lottery, or you got a fabulous new relationship started. It's when you're down in the dumps and you're trying to figure out how to not, spiral down that you're in that part of the bookstore. And, I was in a bad place when I found Don's book. I was having a tough time. And I read it, and I read about what he was saying about the 4. Oh, man, that's me. I didn't really, like a lot of people, I didn't think that that's not how I had always been. But it was how I was at that time.
Sure.
But me finding myself as a 5 was a bit of a process. And I always tell people, you don't get a gold star for figuring your type out right away. And a lot of times you might be right, but you might not be. And you have to hold that as a possibility. But when I met Don Riso, his take on it was, I'm not sure that you're a 4. I'm not sure what you are, but I don't think you're a 4. And so I start working with him, and we were having, day-to-day interactions. So he was having more of an opportunity to observe me. And I was learning it better. And partly we started to see how something that I think is still an ongoing process in the field, how you set up the parameters for what defines type. You can make it too tight, and then it will usually strongly resemble you and your preferences. We when we're teachers, we tend to deify our own qualities and make that, this is the definition of my type. It looks just like me. But there might be variations that don't look like you. And so the other side of it's so loose and sloppy, anybody could be anything, and that's not helpful either. So how do you work that in a way? And what we saw was that the description of the 5 was a little narrow. So, unless you had, masking tape on your glasses and, a pen holder and a slide rule, you weren't a 5. And I thought, well, there's a lot of things about this that do fit me. And as we explored it over, like 2-3 years, it came to the conclusion that 5 was the central piece. It was also, I think, what helped me figure it out. And when I'm teaching the Enneagram, I'll mention this. It was the inner lines. Like if I was a 4, my inner lines would be 2, and should see a lot of 2, and 1, and I should see a lot of 1. Not really. I mean, once in a while, but that wasn't a main feature of my personality. Whereas, then, oh yeah, there it is. 8, oh yeah, there it is. And that really helped. And it was, I also went through a period of just trying them all on. I said, I'm going to be a 9 this week, and it'll be a 1 this week, and it'll be a 2. Just see what I could see looking at myself through these different lenses, which is, I really think that's a good exercise. But when I hit 5, I knew that I was hitting pay dirt because it was ouchy.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm sure for you too. When you really get it, it's a relief, but it's also, there's a grief involved, actually.
Oh, yeah, I'm familiar. Yeah.
Seeing what this pattern has done for you, but you also see what it cost you.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So on that note, what was the ouch?
The ouch was, how can I say, when we live inside a pattern, we don't know that we're living inside a pattern, which is why it's hard for people to type themselves.
Right.
We just think that's reality, right? And we don't, it's like the Johari box. There's what we don't know that we don't know. And I didn't know how desperately disconnected I was, how unplugged I was. Now, I kind of had hints from the Gurdjieff work because I realized it was such a struggle for me to find my body. I did, but it took a lot of conscious suffering, as they say in the Gurdjieff work, to really be able to land in myself enough. But I had to have a little bit of that before I could start to touch the emotional part of it and the realization of my isolation.
Yeah.
And I, when I talk with fives about this, I said, we are all safe and cozy behind our wall, but if you touch the wall, you actually start to feel what that wall has cost you. And it feels catastrophic. It feels like there's no way I can deal with this. And I always encourage them, yes, you can deal with it, but, your grief and tears are there already. They're not going to kill you. And there's freedom on the other side. There's certain parallels between the journey of 3 and 5, actually, that, I think in both cases, we've protected ourselves from a kind of how much we'd be overwhelmed by our feelings. In certain
Sure, I can relate to that. Yeah. This theme of isolation is really important for 5, and I'm thinking about just knowing you a little bit and how people-ly you are, how oriented to people you are. I know you like to go out to dinners and stuff like that. You're a pretty people-oriented person. And can you talk about that in relation to the word isolation, or was there a journey of moving towards people? What is it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How isolated, what was the nature of your isolation, and was there a before and after?
Well, yeah, there is a before and after. And even now, on one hand, yeah, I'm friendly, but I live alone, and I've lived alone almost my entire life. I have only cohabited with people who needed a place to stay for a while. And I offered them a place in my home. But I have never cohabited with anybody. My therapist teased me about that. I said, I think I might be ready to have a real partnership. And he said, he realized that might lead to cohabitation. We laughed, But it's just like there's a way in which I spend most of my time alone. I do dine a lot. And from time to time, I take friends out who wouldn't be able to go to a nice place otherwise. But 3/4 or more of the time, I dine alone. I think the friendliness came from the wish to connect with people and being interested in people, and not having a reflexive, reactive belief that people were kind of stupid and have nothing interesting to say to me. But when I was, as a child, and my sisters would definitely bear witness to this, I was very alone as a child. I spent most of my time playing with my chemistry set or, toy dinosaurs or creatures and stuff in the basement. I didn't really play. My mother would get if my mother was an Enneagram 8, and it freaked her out that I was so alone. She thought there was something wrong with me. And so she would lock me outside of the house so that I'd go play with other kids. And then in stubborn fashion, I would sit on the porch all day doing nothing until she opened the door and let me in. And she would cry when she did that, which made me feel bad. But I also, I just didn't want to go. See, that's the difference. It was like I didn't feel as a child I was missing out on anything.
Right.
By being told it.
Yeah.
I thought it was fine. I thought watching the ants was more interesting than playing with my kid.
Yeah. That goes to your Johari box thing of not knowing what you're missing out on, not knowing what you don't know. Yeah. Exactly.
Some of my colleagues used to love a story I told in the early days where my dad was not around a lot. My dad's a good old Enneagram 6, and he would occasionally be around. He'd make kind of little efforts to get me to be quite more normal, And then when he'd see they weren't having much effect, he'd give up, essentially. But I remember he was trying to show me how to play catch as a little kid. So he and his buddy were in the front yard throwing a ball back and forth, playing catch. And I was just sitting on the porch, and I remember very well watching this. and seeing it and go, okay, so he's got the ball, throws it over to the other guy. Now he's got the ball. Now he throws it back. And it didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't understand why anybody would want to do this. But you see, I wasn't in any way aware of the kind of kinesthetic pleasure that you would get from doing that. I was purely cognitive, and I didn't understand it, so I didn't do it. I was always the last kid picked for the sports teams or at gym class and everything. There was a girl who had polio and me, who were always the last to be. And I didn't mind, I had a certain detachment from any kind of feelings or shame that would have come up about that. Occasionally, it would be humiliating enough that it would get my attention. But it wasn't, I had a few friends, but basically they'd come over and they'd just play with my toys, or we'd play a game, play Risk or something like that. But more often than not, I was on my own. It wasn't like I didn't want anybody. I wanted to have, some friends, but I didn't have a sense of being connected to anyone. And it's still hard for me. I mean, I love people, and there are people in my life I care deeply for. People in my life I've made sacrifices for. There are situations of people that I'd probably give my life up for. And it doesn't always translate into me feeling like part of the family or connected to anyone. So I live in this kind of weird kind of state. Well, I'll tell you another thing about that as you're asking me this question. I don't think it was in any way fixable on the level of personality.
I see. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there wasn't some way I was going to turn into this kind of friendly guy. There was not some way I was going to suddenly feel safe around everybody on a personality level. And a lot of it was just about, again, 5, 6, 7's fear, right? I didn't feel safe around people.
Yeah.
And I'd sort of tentatively try to trust people. As I developed more presence and could be embodied more, it was more feeling the connection of everything, which is very different than being able to feel like I'm a welcome member of something, of a family, of a relationship, a partnership, anything. So, it was, I had to kind of get to a very deep place to be able to break out of the box of it and actually go out and engage people. The big breakthrough, actually, the one that I see as a kind of a huge turning point. I mean, I had some from the Gurdjieff work and from the embodiment and from just developing a little bit of confidence at college and stuff like that. I had a certain narrow focus of friendships and so forth. But when I met Don Riso, we started going and doing certain work together. We started going to 12-step programs. Now, I wasn't an alcoholic or an addict, but I realized I came out of that background. So I was learning about alcoholism in families and stuff like that. I got interested in the sort of codependency work that was coming out back then in the late 80s, early 90s. And we went to a John Bradshaw workshop that was held at the Jacob Javits Center here in New York. And there were exercises and things to do. And I went there with Don and with some musician friends of mine, which I won't name. I won't bust their anonymity, but they're famous musicians. And we went there together. And there was a point at which we were talking about it's not always that bad things done to you. It's the absence of ingredients that you needed. And how neglect can be, in some cases, as traumatizing or more traumatizing than certain other forms of abuse.
Right.
So, and so I've been a little advocate of talking about that over the years. But in any case, we did an exercise where we took turns getting on the floor, and then we were surrounded by our friends. In this case, they really were friends. And we just kept saying to people these kind of things that little children need to hear, but that they generally don't hear. And I just cracked open. It literally felt like something breaking in my chest. It wasn't like there wasn't just some tears. It was like emotionally vomiting almost.
Yeah.
It was my chest cracked open, and just all of this grief and sadness and need and all this icky, messy stuff that I did not want to deal with, just gushing out. And thank God I was with Don and these good friends of mine who were there holding the space, because I was a mess for days. But I lived, and it was just, in terms of psychology, I mean, I could, in hindsight, say, oh, that was schizoid detachment that you just passed the other side of.
Yeah. That's profound. I have stories from my Enneagram journey that are similar, where I shared something, exposed myself for the first time, revealed something about myself from my past that was a secret that I thought would take with me to the grave. And, things about deceptions and dishonesties in the past and stuff like that. Just the breakdown and the cracking open and being witnessed in that state and being held in that state, that was really powerful and important for me.
Yeah.
Were you able to receive other people's holding of you in that moment?
Yeah, I in that moment, yes, I needed it. These were people I trusted, people I respected, and they had the love and power and intelligence to let me go through it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody would fix it, which would have been good.
Right.
And they were affected. I mean, they all had tears,
Mm-hmm.
My grief was so enormous. I think they just were carried on the wave of it. But I think that I was able at that time. I would say it's always been, I don't think anybody really receives easily. I think everybody, something we all have to learn. There's no Enneagram type I can think of that says, oh yeah, I'll receive. Nobody does.
Right.
All terrified we're going to lose our autonomy, we're going to lose our independence if we need anything from somebody. Oh my God. But I think that you get smarter as you go along. I hope I'm getting smarter about, just letting people be there, letting people offer something, and we do get to say yes or no. That's part of it too. But I think just receiving people, receiving their love is a big deal for most people. And I think, there too, I find that people have their intentions, they have their motivations to connect that are coming out of their own psychological needs. And a lot of times when people think they're loving, they're actually just in that particular structure. But that doesn't mean that love isn't there. That's one thing I had to learn. The love is there in a more subtle way that they themselves not be entirely aware of, but that don't, it's sort of like when we're teaching or facilitating, it's not wise to throw away the message or the teaching because of the limitations of the teacher.
Right.
Yeah. I have my limitations and I do my best to work with them and be aware of them. But I hope that people will understand that despite that, from time to time, something comes through that is actually what's called for, and I've learned that with other people, with me, their efforts may be a little off center, but there's something there that I need to be aware of and respectful of and conscious that that's there. Because if we're not that just reinstates the cynicism and isolation and all that stuff, and been there, done that.
Right. I have a question. So my experience of 5 in general is that they're pretty stubborn about being interested only in what they're interested in. It's hard to pull a 5 into an area of curiosity that they're not inherently curious about.
Yeah.
And what I'm wondering about is, why were you curious about psychology and the inner world? And I know you've mentioned before that you, at a young age, were interested in wisdom traditions and spirituality and things like that.
Yeah.
What was that?
Well, I think it all that for me started with science, actually.
Okay.
I was very interested in science as a kid. And we were in a period of time in the United States where there was some encouragement for that, because we're in the space race and we didn't want to lose out to the Russians. And so any kid that had mathematical or scientific capacities, that was encouraged, right?
Mm.
And I was, very early on identified as what folks called then, and probably still do, called a gifted child. Mm. I was in that, and the end, very, 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 very end of the bell curve. And so everybody, that was, on one hand, people were curious about it, but I also realized it scared people. I don't know. I think in hindsight, people were afraid I would see something about them. So I kind of go out of my way to not give people that. We used to joke that 5s, that 9s gaze at people and 5s peer at people.
Okay. Yeah.
As I'm definitely, my family's story was there's a child, they called me the little old man, because they'd go up to sort of play with me and I'd just stare at them and it freaked them out, actually. But I think the science interest, I don't know. I felt, and this may be something just in the soul of 5, there was this question, what the hell is this that I've landed in? What is this world?
Yeah.
What's behind all this? How does this work? And anything I could learn about nature, science, the universe, animals, I wanted to learn about. My mom used to tell the story of how I was in the bathtub and I was like 3 years old and being very quiet. And then I looked up her and asked her what an atom was. And so she got me a book about atoms. But I just, it was coming out of that. But I think the spiritual thing came from a couple of things. One was I realized that science answered a lot of questions, but not everything. And I was interested, well, what is all this religion that people are into? And like a lot of, I grew up in, my family was not very religious. We didn't go to church or anything like that. We were nominally Christian, right? But it wasn't overt. I had friends who were in other religions as a kid, but I think that my family had one of those big Bibles, with in the middle of it had all these color plates of, Renaissance paintings and things like that, to illustrations of the stories. And I was intrigued, like, what the heck is this in relation to the science? How does this all work? And it bothered me. And I wanted to know about this religion business, but I'm trying to find a nice way to say this, and I don't think I can. A lot of times when I go to these churches or religious groups, I go meet these people, and my impression, although I probably couldn't have put it so bluntly as a kid, was these people are nuts.
Right. Yeah.
They're trying to believe something that, but I knew there was something to what they were saying, but they were missing the boat. And I also felt the people in science had a lot of great stuff, but they were missing a certain boat too. And I really struggled. A lot of my early life was trying to reconcile these two distinct interests. It also, just like I liked art and I liked science. And which way do you want to go? And I knew I couldn't do both, or so it seemed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's also, you could reduce that down to saying, well, you're a 5 with a 4 wing. Well, that's true enough. But I think that kind of question might come up for a lot of people if they're, and I'm not sure what puts that question in people. Maybe it's just there from the beginning. I don't know what it was. When I was very first in the Gurdjieff work, it was one of the first questions I asked. Why is it that a lot of people can have certain experiences and they just shrug them off and go on living the same way, and other people have a certain experience and it busts them open to the kind of questions that we're asking each other here? And in a sense, to my relief, no one claimed to know the answer to that question.
Yeah. Do you have an answer now?
Not anything that wouldn't be, just a tad poetic. It's just, I don't know. It's kismet. It's grace. It's kismet. It's God's will. It's what, I don't know why, but I find it very interesting. I can see why it leads to some weird beliefs that I don't agree with, but I can also see that it's a mystery. And it makes me, it's one of the ways I come back to a softening of my proclivity to judge people for not so much, I don't judge people so much for ignorance, but for valuing their ignorance or defending it. That really triggers me. But I've softened that when I start to understand that you never know when the popcorn's going to pop. You just don't know. There are people in my life that I thought, oh boy, this one's never going to, I'll never have a meaningful relationship or conversation. They're just going to be into their whatever they're into, and that's okay. They can be into that. And then one day, just they're there, and you don't know what happened. There are mysteries. There are nonlinear elements in life that become important. But so I always assume that everyone potentially could show up and be in revealing something of their actual nature. Always the potential. It's not for me to decide who can and who can't, who's gonna and who's not. My job is just to show up with kindness and see what happens.
Yeah. I want to eventually move into kind of what's the growing edge for you now, but before we go there, I was fascinated last time we talked when you talked about being a kid and being physically very tight, not wanting to be touched, things like that. And this goes back to our sense of being isolated, but I think it seems like more than psychologically, there was a physiological thing going on that was cementing your isolation at a somatic level. So do you have a sense of that?
Oh, yeah. I was very touched. There's a really bizarre but moving film called Lars and the Real Girl.
Oh, I love that movie. It's an incredible movie. Yeah.
That's good old Ryan Gosling. I think Ryan in real life is probably a 9, would be my guess.
I think so. Yep.
Yeah, he's just got that everybody likes him. He's pretty easygoing. He's pretty diverse as an actor. But I think the character was supposed to be a 5.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you get a kind of 9-ish 5 in that portrayal. But the scene where Patricia Clarkson, as the psychologist, is working with him, trying to titrate his capacity to experience touch, was very moving to me, because I was like that. I found touch overwhelming. And if somebody wanted to hug me or touch me, I had to take a deep breath. I had to know that was coming. I had to see it. I had to almost prepare myself, because I found the experience of touch, I could still get myself in touch with that sense, but it was completely overwhelming. It was and too much for me. And so I didn't like it. And my sisters thought this was hilarious. They thought one of my sisters is a 3, and the other's either an 8 or a counterphobic 6. She goes back and forth between those. But in any case, they thought it was very funny. They called me Mr. Flinchy because they'd go up and just touch me, and I'd just like a cat. I'd be practically on the ceiling. But it was just a weird thing. And I remember when you get into adolescence and teen years and you're thinking about dating or sex and things like that, this becomes a complication.
Yeah.
It's like, how's this going to work? I remember before I went to Columbia, I went for a bit to the University of Connecticut. And I was there, and there was a dormitory near mine, which was where this was the 70s, and so there's all the kind of alternative community, post-hippie, kind of interesting people were living in this dorm. And I would go over I was just in a normal dorm, but I'd go over to see what these people were up to. And one day I walked in the lounge of the dormitory. They were all sitting around massaging each other. And I saw this. I said, "What in God's name are you guys doing?" And they said, "We're doing massage." And I said, "Does it hurt?" They go, No, it feels good." And they said, "You'll like it." And I said, No. And some really cute girls grabbed me, had me sit down, and they said, "Well, just let us do just a little bit, okay?" And they were and I thought I was going to fly out the top of my head. It was so intense. But I just kept breathing, and they said, "Just feel that we're doing something nice for you. No one's hurting you. This is just a nice thing." And after a while, I could sort of be with it. And then I was years before I got a massage again. But it sort of opened the door like a little crack. Like, oh, okay, maybe there's a way I can get over this. But to this day, it's different now, and all that work and the Gurdjieff work of developing my belly center essentially changed it. But it's still, physical contact is intense for me. It's never a casual thing. It's always a powerful thing for me.
Yeah, and the word overwhelm I think is particularly relevant to the entire 5 structure, and that's a very condensed and particular somatic expression of it. But the sense of being overwhelmed in general, is that something that you relate to, like the vastness and complexity and randomness of the world, or things like that we read in 5 descriptions?
Yeah, it's something I have to work on. And as in this sort of corner of the Enneagram, the overwhelm always comes with a large wave of anxiety.
Right. It's kind of like that.
Oh my God, how with this? And it's sort of like not knowing what to do, wanting to isolate, wanting to hide, wanting to get away, wanting to redirect my attention in some way. One thing when I was younger, I used to do, when I was feeling overwhelmed, I would go play a video game where I'm conquering the world or some such thing. To sort of, I can't handle this world, but at least I can conquer this world. And it was just trying to get in touch with some sort of confidence against the encroachment of, the chaos of the world. And, one thing some of my colleagues say that I really disagree with is that 5s fear emptiness. No, 5s love emptiness. We fear the overwhelm of being.
Right. Yeah.
Imminence of everything is like, and so it's like Edvard Munch, with the scream. That's a very good image. Emptiness is what we escape into, which is different than the 9 escapes into being, just hanging out, being. 5, I just get rid of everything, just annihilate everything, just cessation. That would be fine. And sometimes the other thing, I would either want to do that, or I'd want to find some way of bolstering the part of me that was familiar with or had my own version of that chaos. And that leads to the sort of edgy side of 5. Like if I was feeling overwhelmed, I'm not going to listen to John Denver. I'm going to listen to Nine Nails. I'm going to listen to Tool. I'm going to listen to, something very aggressive and chaotic and intense. And that was another way. I think, and in some way, I think that was like my subconscious line to 8.
Mm-hmm.
That I couldn't get to just straight up the high side of 8, but just the lustfulness and intensity was a way that I try to balance out from feeling overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you describe this feeling, the inner experience of escaping to emptiness? And how is that different from escaping to being?
Escaping to being is sort of like, I noticed 9s could just be really happy with simple things. And people have a strong 9 component, just hanging out in the park, sitting back, watching a TV show, whatever, to zone out in a certain way into being. And I see the 9 in people can do that. I had a lot of trouble accessing that. I've got 9-ish components, as we all do, but that part of it I just never could understand or get to. I probably had a little contempt for it, to be honest.
Sure.
My mom had a lot of that, and so we always got these object relations with our parents, and she'd just sit back with some booze and a cigarette and watch, her soap operas or watch TV for hours, and never do. But for me, it's sort of, it's self-negating, and it's different. And it's often, and maybe this is my forewind coming in, it rides in on a wave of self-hatred, self-rejection. But there's a way of just wanting to just get rid of everything. When I learned about it in spiritual circles, I always had a hard time relaxing into being, but I would almost relax through being into just voidness.
Okay, yeah.
And that, one of my mentors who's no longer with us, she was a brilliant, brilliant teacher, but she used to say, when children have difficulty in their early development, or if there's trauma around, they will often skip being and go straight into what in Diamond Heart we call the absolute. Just disappear yourself. It's too painful. Let's just not be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As opposed to creating a soothing trance as a defense against being. I could never muster that.
I am fascinated because it's kind of like in the 5, there is this polarity happening where on the one hand you escape into the absolute or the void. On the other hand, you whip up such an inner density of concentration on a particular topic. Or at least that's my sense of how it works for inside 5. It's like you're either concentrating and there's an overwhelm of content or just a hyper focus of content in your mind, or nothing.
Right. Well, this is resolved somewhat. Let's see if I got to get a little metaphysical on y'all. Nothing out of space, because the space is a something. And so you actually get closer to the nothing by concentrating to a point. If you go right to the point of consciousness, there's no extension, there's no time, and you almost like go through the point into the nothing.
Sure.
But, people think of the nothing as just like outer space or spaciousness, but it's like spaciousness. Well, it might be in that direction, but spaciousness is a something. It's a feat. And I've always had a certain capacity for that, coming to that place of the point, the singularity, where it all kind of, it's like if you could take the timeline and reverse everything, back to the Big Bang, which is there's no space there. There's no time, there's no space, there's no energy, there's no matter. Boom.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually get closer to it through focus than through relaxation. That you can go actually both ways in my experience now, but my way when I was younger most definitely was by concentrating. It's almost like you concentrate to the point that you bore through the presentation of reality.
Sure. What are you concentrating on?
Well, different things at different times. I learned, to do that through meditation practice. I learned it by, sticking to an inquiry, for example, into something. I would, Don used to call me an intellectual pit bull. That, we'd have a question and I'd be sleepless, just laying there trying to sort this out. It's some of the things that we came up with. For example, we had this whole big elaborate teaching that Don called the psychic structures. And he had this idea that there should be these visual models to show the psychodynamics of what's going on in a type, this visual. I thought it was brilliant. And he had an idea that they should be different at different levels, but he wasn't sure what the mechanism would be that would shift them. And he had some ideas at the beginning, and they were a good stab. But I just took that and wrestled with it. It was like a dog shaking a toy around. I just stayed. And one night, it was usually in the middle of the night, I just woke up and I understood that what was driving the shift was what we now call the inner critic or the superego. And I presented that to him the next morning, and then we elaborated it from there. But it was, when you're seeking some kind of realization or understanding, when you're trying to see through your own misunderstandings, I think it functions a lot like that for me, and I think for a lot of people.
Yeah, this is getting to kind of the, you could call it the essential quality of 5, insight or discovery, something like that. What's it?
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah. Go ahead. Sort of like, what's it like for you when that happens? When you discover something, when you have an insight.
Well, there's the sense of illumination, it actually, like, things get brighter, and there's a feeling of brightness. Now that can experience it more in a kind of 3D embodied way, it happens where you would expect it to. It's in what the Greeks call the nous. There's a point here in the head that just lights up. But I think I'd have to go back and see. It was sort of like that piercing the cloudiness, like the cloudiness of our usual perception.
Yeah.
It suddenly, kind of, it's like you're on a cloudy day and you're suddenly you see the moon or stars or something sort of shining through the clouds, kind of like that. I think now, my station with that is such that it's more ongoing. And so there's a sense of there's nothing up here. Like, it's just blank, nothing. And yet there is a quality of a dynamic outpouring production. Just the realization doesn't feel like an event. It feels like a flow. But that took many, many years of practice and people teaching me and stuff to get to that. That didn't happen overnight. But I could say that I was experiencing it early on, but just as little snippets of it. That is that capacity appeared through the density of my psychological structures. They still assert themselves from time to time. But, it's different once something like that is more established. And I think that people, and this is a place where the Enneagram comes in, that as we get more established in presence, the sort of gift of our type gets more established as a kind of function that's necessary for the whole thing, and that is very clear to me. Like if I again look at the 3 part, it's like what I'm talking about. Realization is happening around functioning, where it's not even a me that's functioning, just functioning is happening, and it's joyful and it's beautiful, and that's why we're here. Yeah.
I have one other question in this mental space territory.
Okay.
So, my experience of you is that, I've seen you teach a number of times, and you have an extraordinary capacity to recall details, and there's a quality of like meticulous memory that seems to just be in you. Like it's like you remember dates and names and old terms and things that it's like you don't lecture with notes. It's just in you, What do you attribute that to?
I have no idea. I mean, I just endowed with that. I have a good memory. I have a specific memory. I think part of it comes from paying attention when those things are happening or when I'm learning them, so that they actually get retained.
Right.
It's the quality of attentiveness. I think some 6s have that too. I'd say that the danger of it is that can function so well as substitutes for the realization and the knowing.
That's it. There, yeah.
I could just get here and reel off a bunch of interesting facts, but I'm not then transmitting a gnosis or something that's occurring in the moment. It's a different thing. It's useful because I think if you have things in your memory to work with, it gives that quality of knowing material to communicate what is known. And that doesn't happen with me trying to do that. It just happens, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's like when I was a musician for years, and there were some people who had capacities like that with music, where they could just do certain things with music, and I'd say, my gosh, how do you do that? But it just, I don't know, they just had that endowment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So back to this topic of the overwhelm of touch, and also the fact that you have lived alone your whole life and cohabitation. What is your experience, or what has been your experience with romance and relationships, if you're willing to talk about it?
Well, I would say I was a late starter. I mean, I had crushes and stuff when I was younger, but nothing that really would count as a relationship. I didn't really have my first real relationships till I was a couple years into university.
Mm-hmm.
And, in those days when I fell in love hard, and it was sort of all or nothing for me. And I probably a little too grasping, because I knew how hard it was for me to find somebody I could even hope to live with. And so in each case, when the relationship ended, I would largely blame myself and just go into a long period of isolation. So there was a sort of intense relationship, 2-3 years, ends alone for a while. And after going through that pattern, of course, each time I went through that pattern, I had the idea, I've got it sorted out now. Next time I won't make those same mistakes. But I saw that no matter what I did, I seemed to keep going back to, I would say, merging with ambivalence. I wouldn't say that anybody I ever dated was a bad person. Nobody was hateful or, anything like that. But I wasn't their wasn't their agenda, wasn't their, the way I put it once, and one of my exes, she got very mad about this. I said, I'm not your choice. I know you love me, but I'm not your choice. You're not choosing me. And so I eventually just came to a couple of conclusions, which weren't exactly cognitive, but one of them was, whatever it is that people are looking to partner with, I'm not that. So does that mean I'll never have a partner? I don't know. It means it's going to be a long shot, and it will take a certain sort of extraordinary openness on both people's part. The other thing was that there was no point in playing out that pattern again. So to not rush into anything, to not be, and to stop grasping. That was, I guess, what I'm saying. I started to realize how I was seeking a partnership to counteract or compensate for all that isolation. And no person could do that. And so I had to one day kind of wake up and ask myself, well, you live alone now. You lived alone most of your life. And here you are, and you're having your morning coffee and everything. If this is it, this is enough. Can you be okay with this? And my answer was yes, I can be okay with this. Mm-hmm. And I felt, and now of course, people would always say, well, that means now you're ready. You could actually meet a partner. Well, maybe that will happen. I'm in no control of that. I'm not closed to having a partner, but I don't have any expectations anymore. And a lot of what drove me to seek one is kind of burned out of me, Yeah. And I like hang out with people. If you're interesting, okay, let's have another conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was picking up like these themes of the kind of unsentimental realism of 5, and what I was thinking about is that there's a fine line between that and kind of the high side of 5, which non-attachment, that sort of stuff, which I think was present in your answer, and also a tendency towards nihilism and just, whatever, kind of eject from the world kind of thing.
So, yes, they're all closely related, and depending on, I can tilt one way or the other because they're not far from each other.
Right.
But I just try to keep coming back. I put it this way, my question is, do you feel love today? Do you feel love for other people? Do you feel other people's love for you? Do you feel the presence of love? Do you feel kindness? And if you're not feeling those things, that's a symptom that you're probably drifting into the cynicism and nihilism and so forth, which is all too familiar with me, But I think that, and a key word for me, which is very different than the way I grew up and how I was most of my life, is tenderness. There's just like no tenderness in my life. And I lived in kind of Spartan ways, so I'm kind of proud of it, and I just, how can I be tender today toward others? How can I receive tenderness today? And I think as long as that part's flowing, I'm not cutting out the reality of love and connection and things that are very important for a human life, but I'm also not lost in the fantasy of a hopeless child.
Right. Yeah.
And so then it is what it is. There's also, you reach a certain age, I'm not a young man anymore. I may think so sometimes in my mind, but I'm not, so what any partnership could be at this stage of life is not like, starting a family. It's not, and the other thing, it's just true for people across the boards. I realized, I was talking about this with my dad of all people, that when you're younger in life and you create a partnership, you're creating a life together. You don't have a life, so you're creating with this person. And so you pick a person, hopefully with whom you can create a life. when you have lived as long as I have, you have a life. Your life is established. And whoever you might end up with, their life is already established, right? And so it becomes a very different exercise to find some sort of Venn diagram where there's my life and your life, and there's this place that we intersect, because I'm not going to give up my life for you, and you're not going to give up your life for me. And so how does it work? So once you're older and you have these things, it's a different exercise in what a partnership would mean, what it would be for, and what it would look like. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the sort of the natural, you would call it, uncooperative stance of 5. And, that was present early in your childhood. I'm thinking about how, just the image of you sitting on the porch or the step after your mom has locked you out of the house as a kind of statement or protest, like, I'm not going to do that, and just, that kind of sensibility already makes 5 a kind of, you could call it a unique or rigid puzzle piece that, like, for another person to fit with you, they have to be a certain shape or be willing to adapt to you. And now with the accumulation of life, you have this life, it's like the puzzle piece has an even more definite shape. And I'm wondering, do you experience with certain people in your life a willingness to adapt or to cooperate in a different way, or is that uncooperativeness still present? How do you work with that these days?
I like to think that I'm more cooperative. And I am and I'm not. I think there's certain things that, if I'm traveling and I want to do something and I'm with other people, I'll say, I'm going to go do this today. If you want to come with me, I'm going at 9. And if you don't, that's okay. But I'm not going to play games with them and come to some sort of group consensus about what we're going to do. I know that usually results in nothing happening.
Yeah.
And so I'm very, same thing. I have certain rules. Like if I go to a movie and people make me late, if the movie has started, I will not watch the movie.
Okay.
I'll leave. Like, I'm not going to, I said, that's it. So I have my little nudgy things like that I do and have. But, when you're talking about partnerships, it's like where you're going to live and everything. So like people say, oh, you'll never leave New York City. You'll never leave Manhattan. You're going to, and I don't know that that's 100% true. I think that I wouldn't live just anywhere, but there are some other places on planet Earth I could probably do okay. And with the right person, that would be a worthwhile exploration. But there are places that, no, thank you. I don't think I could thrive there. And, anybody who'd be with me, the other element of it isn't particularly 5, it's just I'm a public figure.
Right.
And that comes with baggage. It comes with certain trappings. And if you don't want to deal with that, I'm probably not your man, It's and I'm sorry, but I'm not going to give up a lifetime's work so that you can feel secure. It's not going to happen. So that could be an element of that stubbornness, but I don't think anybody who was a ready for primetime player would ask that of me. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. How do you relate to your own publicness, especially given the tendency towards isolation?
Well, it's like, I have a number of friends who are a lot more famous than I am, and we joke about it. And I said, there are benefits. But I always feel, I communicated this once on Facebook, I always feel like the new kid. I grew up, my dad was in the Air Force, we traveled around, and literally I was often the new kid.
Mm-hmm.
And a new kid who didn't have the sharpest social skills, who was not, a quarterback on the football team. And even though I've lived here in New York City since, gee whiz, the end of the 70s, yeah, I still feel like the new kid here. And it's ridiculous because people do know me. And when I go into the restaurants and places around town, I've become something of a fixture in New York City. People, Mr. Hudson, so good to see you. Come on in. How can we, like that. And increasingly, even, the Enneagram is becoming famous enough that people will sometimes recognize me on the street, which is always a bit of a shock. But I think that it only becomes problematic for me when I'm in situations where there's a lot of people who know me, and then they're all coming up and they're all either wanting to ask me that question and then another question, or they want to tell me some story about their journey or what have you and have me witness it. And, I'd love to be there for each and every one of them, but sometimes I've got like 6 or 7 of them at once. And then that overwhelm kicks in and I
overwhelm. Yeah.
I have to ground myself, and sometimes I have to set boundaries, and that's just part of the deal. And I think like a lot of fives, I have a pretty good capacity to keep my life separate from my public work. I think of some of the people who are actors, famous actors that are 5 or at least have a strong 5 component, and they're pretty good at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm wondering about your experience of the withholding of self that we talk about in the context of avarice, and which also is related to the overwhelm that we're describing. Is that a thing that you still work with? And how does it show up?
Yeah, it shows up as a reflex of not wanting to be involved, even when it's stuff that's for my benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I want to deal with this. I want to go back to whatever it is and I not wanting to deal with people, their needs, or even when they're trying to, as I said, help me. It's just an automatic withdrawal, withholding. No, I'd rather do something else. And just realizing I have to, in that moment, practice and come back and say, Jocko, this is important. You need to be here for these people. And it isn't, and if you are, you may even enjoy it. So give it a shot. It's different than like being low social, for example, because I can click in pretty much to awareness of people and where they're coming from and so forth. But that's, and I can, with presence, do things that help the connection. But on the other hand, the 5-ness is, the avarice is this kind of uninvolvement, not interested, withholding myself. There are other elements. Sometimes it feels like not believing that there's anything significant I can contribute to this situation. So why don't I go do something that I could contribute? It can be kind of like that.
Yeah. And there's a rejection piece there, like the identification with offering, or that's the template for relationship, is that I have something to contribute here.
Yes. Yeah.
And people to receive it. Yeah.
Yes. And if they're, and I think another way I experience it is sort of the once bitten, twice shy. It's more like once bitten, 10 times shy. If I've had some sort of kind of interaction with someone or with a group that felt unsafe or whatever, my withdrawal is rapid, intense, and it takes me a lot of work to overcome it. And I do sometimes for certain people or certain situations, it's worth it. And sometimes I write off people in situations, as and I think that's okay. I think there's part of social instinct is realizing this isn't for me. That's social instinct too. It's not just joining everything. What do you join? How do you know? Who do you play with? Right? So, but I have to work with the reflex. And, as I get older, I think when I was younger, I was more interested in seeing or experiencing things. And so that could cut that kind of sexual instinct part, a little bit of the 7 coming in. I was kind of more open to exploring experiences, so that will get me out. But now that I'm older and kind of feel like been there, done that, and my body's getting creakier, I have to work harder because I don't have that other impulse in the same way as I once did. So I have to sort of convince myself. And I was on such a roller coaster for a while of teaching, just being always teaching on the road, teaching. Now that I have more time, post-heart problem, post-COVID, and I can be in my hovel of an apartment with all my books and gadgets and media, I'm getting back into sort of enjoying being in my little castle, And when I do, I have to actually remember to go out and do things. So I have memberships in the museums. I went to the Met the other day. Just said, I need to get my butt out of this apartment and go have some other impressions. So I'll just go look at some art. And I did. And, and again, the back to the beginning, I have no problem going to the museum, going to dinner, going to a movie by myself. If somebody wants to come, great. But, I don't require that.
Yeah. So what's your growing edge now? What's present for you in your inner work?
A lot of it is around my self-pres blind spot. A lot of it is self-care. A lot of it is treating myself better. A lot of it is remembering that I can't deliver my best to other people if I'm not in a good place myself. A lot of it is being smarter about who I spend my time with and what I spend my time on. And I think a lot of it is, I'd say that at this stage of my life, I've had a lot of realizations and breakthroughs, and I've actualized certain elements of my essential nature. But I think that it's a question of developing more consistency. So I go off track less often. And I'd say this sort of touches me to say my view of the world veers very quickly towards, as you said, nihilism, hopelessness, cynicism, darkness. And so I feel kind of comfortable in those realms in a certain way when they're not like, when they don't become parodies of themselves. But and there's a certain point where I think it just gets silly and narcissistic. But I also think that it's a deal for me to keep a sense of belief, hope, keep a little candle fire burning. There's a lot of reasons in the world right now to just roll your eyes and go, fuck them. There's a lot of reason to just say all this help that's been granted to humanity, and this is what all this technology, all this medical science, all these spiritual teachings, all this download, and this is what human beings are doing with it. Maybe we should give. And so, and I wrestle with that.
Yeah.
And I that's it. And I have to wrestle with that, and I have to, and you know what? And I find this goes to the human connection thing. The restoration of my hope comes not from any abstraction, but from meeting awesome people. Meeting people who are parents who are not doing stupid things with their children. Meeting people who are actually trying to do something healing and good for the planet. And in many cases, beyond my capacity or understanding, I just like, wow, that's such a brilliant idea. How cool is that? So it's in that I kind of, it's interesting. One of my old acquaintances from my early days in New York was David Byrne. And I'll readily claim him as one of my Enneagram tribe. I think it's pretty likely that he's in the 5 tribe. But he's been through a similar journey. And he didn't like people touching it. We share a lot. When I was in his apartment, I was laughing. He said, "What's so funny?" I said, "Your apartment totally looks like mine. I guess I have all these floor-to-ceiling shelves, and I've got them all labeled and isolated." And I said, "Only you." He laughs. He says, "You really do that? Do you have little shrines like this?" I says, "I do." So we had a lot of, but the thing was, he's doing his music, but his big project now is he has an organization, and he has a program put out called Reasons to Be Cheerful. And basically it's because he feels so, like, in the same way that these aren't human interest stories. This isn't like the police in Toms River, New Jersey rescued a cat on Wednesday. It's not that. It's him bringing light to people who are doing intelligent things that are helping the planet and reversing the negative trends. And he said, "Where else are we going to find out about that?" So I was very moved by him coming to that. I mean, he'd be the last guy in the world you expect to do something like that. But there it is.
Huh.
It made me think, I saw 9 Inch Nails. I can't remember if it was the last time I saw them. It might have been. It was at Red Rocks in Colorado. And Trent Reznor, another one who I think probably is in my tribe, he got up there, he said, "It's really weird to play these songs now because I feel pretty damn good. My life is good. I'm happy. I feel like I've found what I was always looking for." He says, "But I know these songs came from a real place. I know they're very meaningful for a lot of you. But I'm just saying it's weird for me now to do these songs." And I understood what he was saying,
Yeah.
I think that's another thing about the Enneagram that people might say, "Oh, Russ, you're awfully friendly for a 5," or "Oh, Russ, you do this or that." I said, if you're still 40 years into the game doing the same shit you were doing when you started, you've wasted your time. Like if you're still lost in that 3 stuff after years of studying this, what was the point? Right? We still have to, as I said, you still have this similar devils to wrestle with. They're not going anywhere, but you get more successful at getting a break from them. I'd say that.
Are you still interested in the Enneagram?
That's a good question. I'm not. I feel like some of the stuff that I did in 1992 that people are just finding now. Obviously, I did that in 1992, and people think, oh God, what about this and this? I said, honey, I've been doing that for decades now, and glad you're joining the party. And it's funny to me how often people think they're making a new discovery. And I'll point, look at page such and such, and you might see something. We were working on this full time throughout the entire 1990s, every day, nothing else. And so it came to a lot. And so the part of it is just about teasing out new theories or structures or descriptions of the Enneagram type. Of course, obviously, sometimes I'll get a new insight into a type pattern, but they tend to be on a sort of deeper level now. They're not just descriptors. I'm thinking about the mechanisms like you and I are talking about. And that still comes up, but I'm more interested in it in a broader framework of how it can help people, how it is part of a process of realization, things like that. I'm writing a book with my friend Catherine Bell about how it can be used to help us be more creative.
Mm-hmm.
So things like that are more interesting. And it's sort of like, I don't know, at a certain point when you really learn something, it just becomes part of who you are. You don't have to think about it so much. It's just there, and it becomes a support for other things that you might want to do.
Mm-hmm. What is it about the topic of creativity that has you?
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's, that old dichotomy between art and science and so forth. And, this is a way of just honoring my interest in art and creativity and so forth. And just a legitimate curiosity myself, like what actually helps me be creative and what has messed up the process. So I think that will be the other thing about creativity is I think that after years of teaching this, there are people for whom the idea of inner work is clear, self-evident, and they get it. But there's a lot of people out there who've been wounded by religion. And so anything that smacks of spirituality, they think that's not for them. But most people are interested in creativity. Now, some people may have come to a conclusion that they're not creative, which I'll talk them out of that. But everybody's creative. I said, tell me your dream you had last night. All right, who came up with that dream? Where'd that come from? Who's the author of that dream? That very interesting dream you had. But I think a lot of people are willing to look at a process of self-development that supports their creativity. And for my money, creativity comes from the place that the Enneagram points to, that the spiritual work points to. It's the same place. So it's a way that a lot of people can, in a more secular and neutral way, get into the idea of a work that will help them have a better life too. And if we get more creativity out of the deal, that'll be awesome.
Cool. Yeah. That's a very practical and, I'm resonating with that framing from its pragmatism. And also I relate to, it's who doesn't want to be more creative, but,
yeah.
Do you have any interests that are just totally impractical?
Oh yeah. Lots of them.
This is one of my favorite things about 5 is that they just will follow their curiosities wherever they lead, regardless of practicality.
Well, I mentioned I was just totally fascinated by insects. I have all kind of books about insects, and I studied everything about them. I took university courses in entomology and everything, particularly social insects, just fascinated. Now, did I use some of that knowledge later on in about studying the instincts and so forth for the Enneagram? You bet I did. But that wasn't why I learned it. Just cool and interesting. I have a number of things like that. My musical, I used to be a musician, but my interest in music continues even though I'm not a musician anymore, and movies and stuff like that. I can name you all the Beatles records and what year they were done and what was the sequence of the song recording for each one and the difference between the American and UK versions of the albums, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of geeky kind of fun stuff that I get into that way. We used to know all the stars and the constellations and things like that. I studied natural history, and I was fascinated by the development of life through the ages. This is a lot of scientific stuff was, and some of it's still around. I find that there's so much demand for me to know different things about the Enneagram that takes a lot of my time, but I still get some brain relief by going into these other areas, I'm just a history buff, geography. There's a famous thing in Denmark. I went in to teach in Denmark, and there were people from all over Europe in this big thing, and I drew a map of Europe just spontaneously up there and put a little red star where Copenhagen was, because that's where you are here. But then the whole map of Europe, as I was explaining the history and the transmission, all this. But that was for the Enneagram, but there was a guy who was actually memorizing all these geographical features and countries and their locations. And, I don't know, I enjoy that.
Right.
And again, sometimes like when people have these meetings about my finances or my next work, and I'm wishing I could just go off and read a book about the Saracens or something. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. So, what's this been like for you?
Doing this interview? Oh, it's been fun. Been fun. I mean, I think I've enjoyed talking. I mean, I don't usually get to talk about all these sorts of things, as you were saying, and you're just real easy to talk with. So it was a lot of fun for me.
Cool.
I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate thanks for your openness. And just on a personal note, I've learned so much from all of your content and teachings over the years, and it's really touched and transformed me. So thank you for that too. And yeah, I feel really honored to have had this conversation with you. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Josh. And I do see you as somebody who's carrying the torch and taking this knowledge forward. And I'm very happy to know you and support you in ways going forward from here. So thank you.
Thanks, Russ.
Thank you so much for listening to my interview with Russ Hudson. If you like Russ and you'd like to learn more from him or about his teachings, then everything is on his website, russhudson.com. You can learn about his upcoming workshops and retreats, his books, as well as a year-long certification program that he's doing that I've heard extraordinary things about. Everything, once again, russhudson.com. There will be a link in the show notes. If you liked this interview or you have been a longtime listener of this podcast, then I invite you to like this video on YouTube or subscribe to our channel. It's a zero cost and very effective way to support me and my work and the Enneagram School. Or if you're listening to this as a podcast, then I invite you to leave up to a 5-star review and some words about what you like about the show. If you want to learn about what we're doing at the Enneagram School, you can go visit us at theenneagramschool.com, and right there on the homepage, you can subscribe to our email list, which is where we will announce all upcoming things, including live coaching sessions, upcoming workshops, and also, very importantly, John Lukovich and I are almost done, and we're about to release our first ever Introduction to the Enneagram pre-recorded online course, and we'll be announcing that through the email list as well, so stay tuned for that. If you would like to get officially typed, then I recommend you go to enneagrammer.com and do their full typing service where you submit a video and a collage of images that you select from the internet. Instructions are on their website. And if you get officially typed by them and you think that you might be a good candidate for this show, or you know someone who might be a candidate for this show, meaning you have high resolution interiority and can speak very clearly about your inner world, then I would love to hear from you. So please reach out to me through the enneagramschool.com. Just go right to the contact form. Let me know who you are and why you think you're a good candidate, and maybe we'll set up an intro call. So that's it for me. I really appreciate you watching, and I will see you next time.